Today on The Nation Speaks, marijuana is a thriving industry a decade after the first states legalized it for recreational use. Ben Cort, author of Weed Inc., explains how we've been here before. It's basically big tobacco 2.0. Then in America Q&A, we ask if you could give President Biden one piece of advice, what would it be? Next, we look at marijuana's medical impact. Is it the dream drug it was billed as? And are there unintended side effects? Dr. Ken Finn from the International Academy on the Science and Impacts of Cannabis has some surprising answers. Finally, in our second America Q&A, we ask, what's your concept of a fruitful day? Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker. Today, we look at the legal marijuana industry. Colorado and Washington were the first two states to legalize recreational cannabis in 2012. 17 states plus Washington, D.C. have followed since, and another 5 states have it on their ballot November 8th. Arkansas, Maryland, Missouri, North Dakota, and South Dakota. A total of 37 states allow medical use marijuana. Clearly, acceptability is on the rise. According to a recent Gallup poll, for the first time ever, there are more people in America using marijuana than smoking cigarettes. Another trend is how much stronger the bud is today compared to in the past. It's almost unrecognizable to what the hippies were smoking in the 1960s. Producers have found ways to increase THC levels, and not by a little, but by a lot. In the 60s, average THC levels were less than 2%. In 1990s, closer to 5%. In 2015, it was over 20%. We have 2 guests today from Colorado to give us the inside story on the business of cannabis and its impacts. Joining us now is Ben Cort. He lives in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. Originally from the corporate world, he has a lot of experience in the addiction recovery space. He's also the author of Weed Inc., The Truth About the Pot Lobby, THC, and the Commercial Marijuana Industry. Ben, welcome.
Oh, thanks so much, Cindy. Pleasure to be here.
I'm very glad you're here because I want you to help us understand the cannabis industry. I think there's probably still this stereotype of small growers and quirky storefronts, but I gather that's not the case.
Those days came and went very, very quickly. It was all a pretty well orchestrated smokescreen, if you will. The money behind this was always huge multinational corporate interests. The money was the same money that supported tobacco and big pharma in its early days of the OxyContin disaster. So the plan always has been to move towards this commodities market, really is the best way to say it. The gentleman who ran the Drug Policy Alliance at the time, and they were the main force behind passing these bills 10 years ago, in a TED International talk that he gave, he described cannabis as well as all other drugs as an undeveloped global commodity. Certainly been no secret to the business community for the last 30 years. The idea here is absolutely not social justice, is not any sort of reform in a meaningful way. The intent here is to get richer.
So let's talk about that, and maybe you can connect some dots for me. I mentioned in the intro that the THC levels in cannabis have gone up almost exponentially since, say the 1960s. I didn't realize that. What is the mechanism behind it? Why is that happening?
It's actually really simple. So any sort of industry that has addictive potential is absolutely dependent on the problemed user. The alcohol industry, the stats that we've had for about 60 years will tell us that roughly 20% of the consumers consume about 80% of the alcohol. It's certainly the same thing with the opiates in that crisis, and absolutely with tobacco. The Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division's report last year showed us that a little under 7% of all of the consumers purchased about 76% of all of the cannabis or THC products in Colorado. So all of these industries are absolutely dependent on the problemed user. And the problem with THC, which is the active ingredient in cannabis that gets you high, is you build a tolerance to it very, very quickly. And since there's no lethal overdose associated with it, there's no point where you'll stop breathing, your heart will stop beating. You can build that tolerance essentially into perpetuity. So the more problemed the user is, the higher the concentration that they have to consume and the more frequently they have to consume just to come back to that dopamine baseline.
Our next guest is Dr. Ken Finn, joining us from Colorado Springs. He's the president of the American Board of Pain and Medicine, and a decade ago he served on Colorado Governor's Task Force on Amendment 64, which legalized recreational marijuana. He's the editor of Cannabis and Medicine, an evidence-based approach, and he's a vice president at the International Academy on the Science and Impacts of Cannabis. Dr. Finn, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
There's two sides of this I'd like to ask you about if there's time. The first was that medical marijuana was the initial approval, and was strong justification for that, so I want to ask about that. But second, and where I want to start, is what we've seen in the decade since the legalization of recreational marijuana in Colorado, especially I think with this high potency cannabis that's being sold. What can you tell us about what you've seen and maybe how that might be countering expectations?
Well, I hope you can hear me okay, but we have had medical marijuana since 2001, and although I do believe there may be components of the plant that have medicinal value, I think the industry has circumvented the FDA drug development process, and a lot of these products are frequently contaminated and unfortunately poorly regulated. From a healthcare perspective, this has really created a public health and safety concern. With an increased use of and utilization of our already strained healthcare system. We have poison control calls are skyrocketing across the country in states that have both medical and recreational programs, particularly in the 0 to 5 age group. And these kids don't handle cannabis like an adult, and 4% of these kids will end up on a ventilator. We have healthcare costs rising related to marijuana-related emergency room visits. We have marijuana-related driving fatalities increasing across states like this, and it certainly has not helped our opioid epidemic and actually may be contributing to our opioid epidemic.
What is it contaminated with?
Pesticides, fungicides, anticoagulant rodenticides, heavy metals, labeling. There's mislabeling, so what is in the package may not be actually what's in the product or on the label. Like CBD, for example, a lot of them don't have any CBD in it, and many of them actually have THC in it.
I've seen some of the charts that show that opioid overdoses have gone up along with the legalization of marijuana. Is there a causation there, or just a correlation, or what do you make of that?
I do think there's a very strong correlation, and I do feel there may be a causation. Because if we look at the death rates in states that have both medical and recreational programs, the death rates increased post-legalization. So I do believe that the legalization of cannabis is maybe contributing to our drug overdose epidemic across the country.
What do you suspect is the mechanism of that?